Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the March 11th, 2021 meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee for the Review of the Mamaroneck Code of Ethics. Is there a motion to open the meeting?
I make a motion to open the meeting.
Is there a second?
I second.
All in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
Meeting is now open. We are welcoming to the meeting tonight Agostino Fusco, the village clerk treasurer, and Sally Roberts, the deputy clerk. Thank you both for joining us this evening. As you know, we have since October been examining the Code of Ethics in contemplation of revising the code at the request of the Board of Trustees. And there can be no public officials more important to the Code of Ethics than you both, because you have significant responsibilities with respect to overseeing and administering the code. So we thought it was important to hear your views. One of the reasons we very much want to meet with you is that we are making certain suggestions to revise the code which directly involve you. And it is incumbent upon us, before we put those into the form of recommendations to the Board of Trustees, that we consult with you and ask your opinion, because in effect, what we're doing is we're giving you work. And before we can give you work, I think it's only fair to ask you if you agree with what we recommend, and if you have the means and capacity to take on the responsibilities. In addition, we very much welcome your views on the code itself. You have lived with the code for several years now, and we would, aside from what I communicated to you in my email regarding certain sections of the code, we would be very interested in hearing your opinion on how the code works or doesn't work, and anything else regarding aspects of the code. So with that in mind, what I had planned to do was to go through those sections which impact your office. And we can do that in that order, or if you prefer, we can ask you if you have any opening statements, remarks, comments that you would like to make that would be of interest to us. So in that regard, I would ask you both to tell us whether you have such views, or you want to go right to the sections of the code we have in mind.
For myself, I think we could go right to the code. The only thing we noticed was on 21-5A, distribution of code of ethics.
Yes.
That's being done by the village manager's office through Power DMS. If you want to change it to the clerk treasurer's office, you would have to get another license.
So that goes to the village manager? It is just
Power DMS. In order to effectuate it in my department, we would need an additional license.
okay. Could you point me specifically to what you're referring to?
21-5.
Yeah, A, distribution of the code. And it says the village manager shall cause a copy of the code to be distributed to each village officer, etc.
Yeah, this form says the clerk treasurer.
That was
On the RACI matrix.
Yeah, I just fixed that. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
I just fixed it.
Okay.
Dan, I agree with Augie. I don't really have a statement as far as the code in general. We can just go through the sections of the code that affect us.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we'll start with 21-5, and we've made some editorial changes which I don't think are necessarily worthy of comment. I think we made it a little more inclusive. But if we go to the top of page 12, which I've highlighted here, the Mamaroneck Code of Ethics shall be distributed to each village officer, board member, employee, committee member, and village consultant annually. Now, we have had discussions as to whether it should be distributed on a specified date.
It might make sense. I believe it would make sense to do it before we distribute the annual disclosure form. So people read the code, they understand the code before they have to fill out their annual disclosure form. And as all new, at least board and committee members come on the first week of December at the annual organization meeting, it might make sense to do this right at the beginning of the year, sometime in January, to everyone who's on board at that time. And then as new people get onboarded, of course, you would do it when they get onboarded. But to me, it would make sense to do it at the beginning of the year after everyone has just come on the boards and committees and before they have to do their annual disclosure.
So Sally, following that, why wouldn't it make sense to do it in early December after the organizational meeting?
Well, you would have to do it more in mid to late December, Ellen. The first and second weeks of December are probably the busiest, but I don't have to do this, so it doesn't affect me. They're probably the busiest weeks for me because whenever a board or committee member is appointed, I have to send each of those people a letter in addition to the code for their committee, in addition to a committee summary sheet, in addition to redoing the roster. So it would be okay to do it mid to end December, but with holidays and things, I don't know. I think, the first week of January is just cleaner for me because it's for that year.
Okay.
Again, since we're giving you the work to do you have a preference as to whether we specify a particular date, like the first Monday in January, or whether it should be the first week in January?
First Monday in January is probably the busiest time for us.
But this is something, Augie, that's done by Karen, because this is the code of ethics and it's done by DMS in the village manager's office.
And they're probably going to come to us with questions. So,
I mean, I have to get them the lists. That's
Yeah.
the thing that I do have to do for them. Give them the list.
it's challenging when you have a line of taxpayers out the door trying to answer those questions.
Wait,
But any time that you think is doable.
Sally, what do you have to give them the list of?
The people who need to get it. So any
The
new
code of
board or
ethics
committee
goes
member.
to- Oh, they wouldn't have that?
No, I mean, I have to prepare it.
Okay.
From who, I have to prepare the roster. John, you know the roster, or you know the roster. I have to prepare the roster after everyone is appointed to those positions. So it might be better the second week of January, because Augie's right, the first week of January is very busy for us with taxes.
We say the second Monday or the second Tuesday in January, second Monday in January.
Yeah, I think that seems reasonable.
All right, none of this is etched in stone. So after the meeting, if you guys confer and decide that there's a better date, you just let us know. We want this to be, if it doesn't work for you, then it's not going to work for the village. So just let us know. Okay, we go on to, let's see. We have adjusted or made some changes in the disclosure statements, and under I don't think we've made any substantive changes here, but the subject of disclosure statements has been part of almost every meeting we've had with respect to compliance, non-compliance by busy people, not for any wrongful reason. And as you administer or accept these disclosure statements, is there anything about the way in which they are filed or filed late in a tardy way that impacts your work, makes it harder for you to do what you need to do? Is there anything that you've thought of that we could change that would encourage more compliance?
The longer something stays open, the longer I have to keep remembering to follow up with it. So if we could get them to comply, but there is no stick, and I know that you're working on that. We've had board members who never complied and nothing was ever done about it. Committee members, not board of trustee members. Nothing was ever done about it. So it's, it's constant follow-up. So,
Yeah,
so that would help. And the only thing I see in here that we're not doing right now is you say that the disclosure must be made to his or her immediate supervisor. I don't do that now. We get the disclosure forms in, they go to the Board of Ethics. I don't really even look at them. I don't know if that's something that the Board of Ethics is doing at this time, if they're letting their immediate supervisor.
Oh, that actually came, if I remember correctly, from New York State as a mandate.
Who would be a
Not
supervisor for a board or committee member?
To me, it would be the Board of Trustees. That's who appointed them.
Well, we're not doing that now. So that's something that would have to be done. And I don't know if that is something that would be done by the Board of Ethics or by me or someone in the clerk treasurer's office.
All right, so that's a question. I think right now I have it as you guys, but to be discussed.
Okay. We provided that the disclosure may be maintained as a public record. Is it a public record?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. With respect to getting trustees to comply, we had considered suspending non-filers from office. And we, after consulting with John Mancini at the Conference of Mayors, decided that, or he told us that there is no authority to suspend an elected official. So we provided for a suspension for others, but we can't do it for elected officials. Okay, 21, page 14. Did I do everything? G. Yeah, suspension from office for a non-filer. I. Now here we've given you responsibilities. In the event that you or the board determines that disclosure statement contains there was a misstatement or omission, you inform the individual, the filer, the covered person, and then they have to amend the statement if it's missing material information, and they have to cure within 10 days. And if receiving a notice of objection, the Board of Ethics decides whether the disclosure statement is sufficient. So there we've kind of, I think we've given you a duty that you don't now have.
How would we know if something's omitted? How do you know what's not there?
I mean, short of comparing it to prior year's submission that was handed in.
One way to do it.
Or I don't know that we're imposing upon you an affirmative duty to investigate. We're empowering you with the duty, if you do observe something you know to be false or omitted, we're empowering you with the ability to inform. So you're no longer passive. You can inform a filer, wait, you left something out that we know to be true. And then they have a duty to reply or object, and the Board of Ethics can take action.
But
This is something that, sorry, Ellen,
Go
Right
ahead.
now, as I said, there was a time when I didn't even open the envelopes. But then we determined that these are public documents. So I open the envelopes and I give them a quick glance just to make sure that they're filled out and they're signed. But I don't review, we don't in the clerk treasurer's office review these disclosure forms at all. That is entirely up to the Board of Ethics.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, Sally. We have previously that the Board of Ethics reviews the disclosures. So this opening line, we're assigning something to or, which means it could fall through the cracks.
Okay.
I think it should be, I agree, I think it should be the Board of Ethics.
But I
But
think.
you would want
I
us
think
both to-
inherently- I think inherently in this, you have, in the disclosure, you're having people fill out as completely as possible the information that they know. And if it comes to light in a public forum or even in a private forum, if somebody notifies the ethics board that there is an oversight potentially in somebody's disclosure, then it needs to be amended. I mean, I think that's what, it seems like that's what we're trying to get to.
Right, but who has the action? The
But
follow-up
I don't
action
know
plan.
how Augie or, I don't know how the clerk treasurer's office would be informed as to whether or not something is complete or incomplete.
Yeah, there may have been a presumption on our part that the statements are examined, and perhaps the better choice is to centralize it with the Board of Ethics, and this way complaints flow to the Board of Ethics, and it doesn't fall between the cracks. Any other views on that?
No.
All right, so we're going to revisit this. We'll take another look at that. All right, so now we're going to go to 2113.
You're moving the disclosure date up to January 15th. It's now February 15th. If you go back up to the previous page, Dan, yeah, look down just a little bit. It's in blue. It says by January 15th. It's February 15th in the code now. Are you moving that up?
Oh, it is?
Mhm.
No, we didn't. I don't believe we touched that. Or did we? It is now February 15th?
Yes.
I don't recall whether there was a reason why we changed it. If we changed it, I don't think we did. We'll make it right now conform to the,
I don't think that, maybe there was no date here and we added it.
I think it's just notifying them of their obligation, because we're saying that the Board of Trustees, and I forgot what that date was.
I think Ellen's on it, right? I think this is about the notification, not necessarily the filing.
Correct.
date.
Oh, I see. Okay.
This is just the FYI.
But it says their obligation to file an annual disclosure statement by February.
No, it's the notify
Yeah,
those people of their obligation, notify, so maybe we could tighten the wording, but it's the notification.
Oh,
Yeah, I
I
think
see. Yes.
Maybe it should say notified by
Yeah.
January 15th.
Of their obligation to file by February
Yep.
15th.
Yeah, we could clean
So-
up that wording to make it clear.
so why don't we make it the same date that we made it the earlier one? Second Monday.
Well, no, because prior to this, or someplace, we have the Board of Trustees have that time frame to review who's on the disclosure list
Okay, right.
and modify. So all we were trying to do was line it up. So the Board of Trustees has to do this immediately in January. Then we notify people, and then they have until February 15th to do it.
All right, so what we're saying is that the notification must be made by January 15th.
Correct, correct.
All right,
Augie? Do they have to go over this list and decide on the list at a board meeting?
I
No.
don't know if it needs to be at a board meeting.
An executive session? I mean, they can't meet together as a body unless it's a board meeting or an executive session. So we want to make sure we have enough time in there.
Yeah, but I mean, the list should be pretty consistent every year. The list should be positional, not personal, you know?
Correct.
It shouldn't say John Hofstadter has to file. It should say John Hofstadter as member, you know, member of whatever committee.
Yep.
No, I agree.
Any
I
members
agree.
of the
But
committee, any chairs of the zoning board, any, you know, whatever.
I think that still needs to be done at a meeting.
Yeah, I think that has to be done at a meeting, but it should be pretty simplified because it should be pretty consistent year to year. And, you know, the only thing that would change would be, you know, if positions are added or committees are added. You know,
Hopefully that's the case, John, that it would be simple.
right.
Yeah, nothing's ever simple.
But that gives them, but January 15th, between the annual organization meeting and January 15th, that gives them, because you have to think about, you know, you have Christmas and Hanukkah, and New Year's. So that would conceivably give them 2 meetings to discuss and decide on the list.
Yeah, but they can decide on the list today. You know, they could theoretically decide on the list today, and they
That's
just
true.
have to ratify it before it goes out.
That's true.
So that the only delta per se would be if, John's point, we added a new board or committee.
Right.
Or
Or
a
a
new
new
personnel,
position.
like, or a new,
Yeah, or a new position. Yep.
Okay, that should work then.
So still, they have 12 months to do it in reality.
You're right, they could do it anytime.
Yep.
Are we leaving it at January 15th?
Yes, please.
Okay. And I'll
Because otherwise the February 15th date will never be met.
yeah. I will clarify it. So it doesn't look like you have to file on January 15th. So thank you for catching that, Sally. Okay. We will now go to 21, page 19. E.
Or 2114.
2114 E.
We have 13 E and F. Is that for us too? No, that's not for us.
No, maybe I'm at 2114 E and F. No.
What are you looking for?
Relating to complaints made against.
Yeah, that's it.
I think we're just pointing out to you that the yes. The any investigation of the Board of Ethics or a member of the Board of Ethics based on a complaint, a complaint goes to the Board of Trustees, and it will be investigated by the Board of Trustees or a designated officer, designated hearing officer. So I don't think this actually relates to you guys. So let's go to what was 10A on page 8. I'll just go there and then go to the relevant section. Sorry. 17. Oops. Bear with me. There we go. Okay, under 8, we had the heading, Board of Ethics shall have the following powers and duties. And the provision said that the Board of Ethics would provide training and education to municipal officers, board members, and employees. And we view this as an HR type function. We did not think a board of part-time volunteer committee members could administer to all of the village of Mamaroneck training and education. And we transferred this. We are suggesting that this be transferred to the village manager, page 22. And under B, the village manager shall publish, post, and distribute ethics educational materials and be responsible for the development and presentation of ethics educational programs. And then there is a section regarding the providing a copy of the code of ethics by the village manager to relevant parties. And we've provided responsibilities for electronic communications.
Wait, Dan, go back. Based on the discussion we just had, shouldn't that be the clerk treasurer? Didn't Sally just say they do it for new hires?
So
No, the village manager.
Issues the code of ethics to new hires?
The village manager does that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we have a program, DMS, and that's how we do all of our training and our sexual harassment training, our violence in the workplace training. All of that is done through DMS, our
Okay.
document management software. So to me, it makes sense. I mean, I would probably run this by the village manager, but to me, it makes sense to have it all centralized through our document management software.
Okay.
okay, so in effect, what we're doing is we're recognizing what already goes on.
Well, the village manager is now required to provide ethical training content? Or is
Yes,
that from the Board of Ethics?
no, it goes to the village manager. The Board of Ethics can make recommendations to the village manager on materials, but we're putting this responsibility with the village manager.
Because a lot of that can be electronically delivered to people, like just like the Power DMS system, there are ways for a lot of the maybe not the specifics of the village ethics law, but certainly state ethics regulations. There are off-the-shelf packages that can be distributed to the employees.
Under C, we have provided that the code of ethics goes to officer, board member, employee, committee member, village consultant, and business entities doing business with the village prior to the commencement of their work for the village.
Does that mean
And-
people who, like Staples, people who supply our paper?
Well, that's a good question. The intent is not necessarily who you buy paper from, but if you are letting a contract, for example, between Staples and another paper provider, and there's a bid, it's more for those who are seeking to do business with the village, where it's a competitive bidding situation. They need to know they can't offer benefits or gratuities. It's to educate those who do business with the village. So your question is a good one, and it reminds me of it's a good example. I wrote the first code of ethics for Kmart back in 1996. And when I presented it to one of the guy who ran all the Kmart supermarkets, he said, I am not sending this to Procter & Gamble. I need to have Tide detergent on my shelves. So it's very similar to the question you just asked, because we kind of presume Staples is not interested in paying benefits, improper benefits, but we do want people who may dig up the roads or are competing for contracts to know that we have a code of ethics and you have to abide by it.
Can you make it clearer to the person who's going to be doing this?
We can always make it clearer, so that if you're just calling up Staples and ordering toner, then it
We
doesn't.
have, I don't, Augie turned his camera off, but I'm sure he can still hear us. I mean, we have thousands of vendors that we deal with. And when I look at this, like, to me, it would be that we have to send everyone that gives us a 1099, or we give a 1099 to, or whatever that other tax thing is that we give any vendor, that we would have to give this to them as well. That's how I would interpret it. And that's the thing. I think this leaves it open for interpretation.
Right, but why, we wouldn't be giving a 1099 to Staples for buying paper, would we?
It's not a 1099, it's something else. Oh, I don't know if Augie's still there. It's, if you're not a corporation, you have to give us a, what is it, Augie? A W something? I don't know. what it
You're
is.
talking about a tax ID number?
No, but it may have to do with the tax ID number. Yeah, anyone that bills us, that's not a corporation. I think it should just be clear who, exactly who you mean that we should be giving this to. Anyone doing business with the village.
Okay, as I mentioned at the outset, we're not looking to add needlessly to your day-to-day responsibilities, but we do want.
Dan, sort of before you go on with that.
Yeah.
So do you see a contractor, like a planning board applicant comes before the village? They have a large engineering company or an engineering consultant that is working on their behalf, that is getting paid out of escrow funds by the village. Would they have to fill out or acknowledge the ethics code?
I'm not sure I understand the example exactly.
So an applicant comes before the planning board. They have a consultant who is an engineering consultant. And that engineering consultant is being compensated via an escrow account from the building department, from the building department, essentially, for fees that they, for the review of the application.
Yeah.
Does that consultant have to sign off on this?
I think so.
I would presume yes.
Yes.
I would think
There
so.
are consultants, John.
Pardon?
Though there are consultants. They technically work for us, and then we bill the applicant for the work that they've done for us.
Right, all right. I mean, but that's my point. My point is they would still have to sign off on this and acknowledge receipt of this.
I would say yes.
I would too. What about the guy that fixes our air conditioner? Like somebody like that. That's more what I'm thinking about.
I would say no.
You would say no?
Yeah, I would say no to that. He's not necessarily.
But we gave
The
him
guy
that
needs
work.
to
Out of
bring the air
all of the plumbers in Mamaroneck, we gave that work to him.
Is it bidded work? Does he is it for a competitive bid, or did somebody call up and get 3 quotes?
Competitive bid.
It depends on the amount of the work. And it also depends if they're on state contract or not.
That went on competitive bid.
I think any
That went out for
situation,
competitive bid, yes.
I think any situation involving a competitive bid, any situation where someone is, where you have the, well, it's under $10,000, so we'll take 3 telephone quotes. I think whoever is submitting a bid, yeah, gets emailed a copy of the code of ethics before a decision is made.
Well, maybe that could be put in there. That could somehow clarify what you mean by business entity.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we've defined business entity. What we can do here is clarify it as to the situations in which the code is communicated to a prospective payee.
Well, if it's clarified, I didn't see the definition, I'm sorry. If it's clarified in the definition, then perhaps that's enough.
Well, business entity is an umbrella term that we've applied to anyone who's going to earn any kind of money from the village.
Which
So-
is now broader than what we've just said here.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. We can work with that. Okay.
So, but to that point, Dan, maybe we need to revisit the definition of business entity.
I'll look at it. Okay. And we have under D here, how often do employees get ethics training, Sally?
Now, I don't think I've had
Little
one
to
in
none.
14 years.
They don't get training.
Little to none.
They get a copy of the code of ethics. And so what we've put in here is ethics training as the responsibility of the village manager. And we discussed this with Tom Murphy when he met with us too. There are online programs, very good ones,
Test
That-
1, 2, 1, 2.
can be administered to employees or covered parties here. They're essentially turnkey, and the employee certifies online that they've completed the training. And so what we're saying here is Village of Amerenik employees and committee members, et cetera, should get annual training. And that goes to now we're not meeting with Jerry Barbario. We're, I guess, informing you that we're going to make this recommendation. Is there anything in this that is problematic or can be done differently or better?
I don't see anything.
I don't see anything other than some of the licensed professionals, their fields let them take ethics training. Engineers, planning boards, they have their own profession annually does ethics training. So they would have more now. That's all.
Yeah, because even if they take sexual harassment training at their jobs, we still make them take ours.
And there's a state course that's available where once a year, I think they do it where you could listen to it, but the training materials are available online at any time. So that could be distributed through DMS as well.
Okay. Next is, let's see, we're on did '21, that was 21G. I think we're through the sections that we referenced. Anything I've missed? Anybody else? Anything I've missed, or anything else that we need to cover with Augie and Sally?
So it seemed like you guys took a look at the racing matrix. Other than the annual distribution and the distribution to new hires, where I assigned it to you guys and it should be the village manager. Any other changes there?
I didn't see anything else.
Okay.
I did not note anything.
This is, if you have an open invitation to come back and visit with us again, if you think of something after this meeting and you have additional thoughts, or you want to change anything you've expressed to us, please feel free to do so. We are working in a fishbowl. Everything is public, but the good part of that is that we're getting great suggestions from people, and we're very, very grateful for your meeting with us this evening. And as I said, please don't hesitate to contact us on any recommendations or suggestions you may have. We are very appreciative of the help that you've given us during the creation of the committee, during our meetings, and the great job you guys do for the village.
Well, thank you for doing this. This is huge.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
All right.
And you're welcome to
Night,
stay,
guys.
but I know you're
Oh,
busy.
no, I'm good. Thanks.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
See you.
Have a good night, all.
Have a
All
good
right, you
night.
too. Thank you.
Well, I am really glad we did that. That's terrific. Okay, it's we've got some time. I'd like to go back to the agenda and continue our discussion of the sections for the next 15 minutes or so. I noted to you in.
Sorry, I don't think we ever approved the minutes for each meeting.
Oh, yes, thank you, Brian. Thank you. We have the minutes of February 18 and February 25th. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of February 18 as amended?
I make a motion to approve as amended.
Is there a second? I see a second. Was that Jocelyn? Was that you?
I was seconding.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? If there is no discussion, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion is carried and the minutes of February 18 are approved. For the minutes of February 25th, is there a motion to approve those minutes as amended?
I make a motion to approve as amended.
Second,
I second.
any discussion on that motion? If there is no discussion, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion is carried. Those minutes of February 25th, 2021 are approved. Thank you very much. Now, moving on to the agenda. Regarding the statute of limitations for bringing actions under the code, I have inquired with John Mancini of the New York Conference of Mayors on whether the statute of limitation applies to time when the Board of Ethics can bring a complaint against a relevant party. And I did hear from him, and he said he's going to research it and get back to me. Let's
Sorry,
see.
on that. I also
Yes.
researched, researched it also and couldn't find really anything. The State Administrative Procedure Act talks about like a reasonable time, but obviously they don't define what a reasonable time is. And then I also looked in the other municipal codes of ethics from the municipalities, and none of them had a statute of limitations either. So I think it's just once something happens, someone can challenge something after the fact, I guess.
Right. Good. Well, thanks for doing that. Hopefully we can get some kind of either something definitive or something that is helpful to us from John. He's been a great resource for us.
Mhm.
On page 4, the definition of village consultant, I've left it as it is, but what I've added is the phrase someone who is paid or compensated. It was not in there before, and I assume that since there can be unpaid consultants, we're unpaid consultants in a way, but I figured that would be appropriate to add that. And as I mentioned, the word is used throughout the code, both with and without the word village, both village and consultant. And I could not see why, other than that it was just, it just was not made consistently throughout. There was no reason, and there's no definition separately of consultant. So it's a long way around of saying is that I did a search and replace throughout the code, with the exception of the one section where I think it absolutely did not have a village consultant in mind, but the word was just chosen. Any comments anybody has on that?
I think it should be broader, the village consultant. I think it should apply to all boards. Like I think on the traffic committee a few years ago, they had a traffic study engineer, which had to be bid, I think. So I think it should apply to them also.
Are you saying, Brian, that there's something that needs to be changed in the language?
I just think it shouldn't list like each board of trustees, planning board, board of appeals. What about like the zoning? Oh yeah, board of appeals. What about like the architectural review board? I think it should be like encompassing any board.
Well, isn't that covered right now in the definition?
Not the architectural review board.
I thought when we use the term board, that covers it.
But it says on behalf of the village to any village officer, board of trustees, planning board, board of appeals, or any village agency or commission.
So should we stick board in there? Is that what you're saying?
You could just say village, agency, board, or commission,
Or also committee.
right?
Like,
Right.
Okay. We can add that.
And the removing of village officer, just is there a reason to remove village officer? I mean, we're all village officers by having accepted taking on this responsibility of participating in this ad hoc committee.
I think I deleted it because it was duplicative.
You-
That was way back. Let me just see if Yeah, office.
Okay, okay, right.
Okay. And let's see. Pages 11 to 12. Okay. And here, what I've done under 21.5A is following our discussion of 2 weeks ago, sought to make clearer the difference between the code of ethics, which is to be distributed to employees, to the, we'll call it VOBEC, and the posting of the general municipal law. There was some confusion, I think, as to whether it was the code of ethics that needed to be posted, and it's not. It's the general municipal law, section 807. So I've made that clear that that's what must be posted.
Yep, I'm in agreement with that.
Okay. And
How long is that general municipal law, those sections?
it's
On the-
it's 2 pages, and it's pretty dense.
Yeah, the font is like microscopic.
Yeah.
I thought I remembered that. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense to include that in the annual disclosure that gets sent out as well, but
No, but this, John, the conflict of interest training course, this was one of the things that came out that was mandated, and the state has this poster available.
no, I understand. But I think to send it to the employees when we send out the annual notification that they have to file a disclosure, this might be also just as another way of maybe getting people to read it. That's all.
All right, I've noted that, and we'll see if that's something we can decide if that's something we want to add.
I also think if you include too much, then people don't want to participate too. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. The other subject that came up, or it occurred to me, and I've put this in my notes too, is I think we're all in favor of electronic acknowledgement and certification, but I don't know that that's something we can write into the code. I think it's something it's something we recommend.
Well, I think that gets more to process and how the village chooses to administer something.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's,
Like we're not stating to use DMS to distribute the code on an annual basis. We're saying it needs to be distributed.
yeah. Yeah,
And
I mean, we want it to be electronic, but we can't tell them how to do it because then it's a matter of software changing all the time. And
Yep.
probably in a year, you'll be able to mentally transmit it through your thoughts and avoid. I remember when floppy disks were around, and we were marveling that you could take a floppy disk home and stick it in your computer and have in front of you the document that you were working on in your office. So since anticipating that we will be teleporting in a year, we won't include anything about that. Okay, let's go to page. How are we on time? Oh, we got 4 minutes. Let's go to page 15.
Actually, while you're going to page 50, Nora, are you still there?
we put her to sleep.
No, oh, wait a minute, hold on. No, I'm here. I'm here.
Any update on distributing our letter to all employees?
I sent a reminder today. I thought I had sent it a couple days. I thought I had sent it last week, but it was in my draft. So I sent another reminder today. I think it's going to go through Power DMS though. So I don't know how robust that response is. I think people are still getting used to it.
Because we had also asked that we be included so that we know.
Yeah. I'll double check. We should have asked that question from Augie. That would have been a good Augie question, because I think, well, if it's Power DMS, it comes out of Jerry's office.
Yep.
And if it's the mailing distribution list, I think that comes out of Augie's office. Augie and Sally.
I thought at the last meeting you had said Jerry was going to use Power DMS for that.
That's what they want to use. So,
Yeah.
and you should get that because you're a village. You're on that, right? I mean, we're all village employees.
Yep.
Even volunteer employees, we're still considered.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you heard anything back.
Yet.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll keep reminding. I was going to say I'll keep nudging, but that's not it. I'll keep reminding.
No, nudge is a perfectly acceptable word.
Okay. Back on this prohibitions regarding what Board of Ethics members may or may not do. I think we agreed to that this is what we were aiming for. No ethics board member shall be employed or by or appear as part of their paid employment before the Village of Mamaroneck Rye or Town of Mamaroneck. Is that what we were gunning for?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
But unfortunately, Michael's not here tonight, and I think
He's here.
He is.
Oh.
He's here.
he's joined
I
us.
apologize. I joined in late and I didn't want to say anything because you guys were talking.
Oh, that's okay. I'm glad you're here because I think this was one of the things you were vocal about. So I was going to say we should wait for you.
I just continue to say that we've separated down to the town of Rye or the town of Mamaroneck, but there are other jurisdictions that overlap here. And so we're identifying certain jurisdictions that overlap and not others. And I know it becomes more cumbersome and it's a larger, you're dealing with county and other jurisdictions, but I just pointed out that, we've identified 2 that overlap and no others.
Yeah, I think we've been through this. What we can do is note to the board that there is a view that it should be broader.
And to Mike's point, I think with the Westchester Joint Waterworks being a shared entity, I don't know why you would have the town of Mamaroneck and not the town, and also not the town. I think we should probably include the town of Harrison, at least. But I understand Mike's point, like, where do you draw the line? Do you go up to the county level? Do you?
Mike, remind us, is it your view that it should be countywide, statewide? I think you said statewide.
Look, when we started this probably 3 months ago, I think we discussed it. I initially had a position that, yes, they should all be included, but other people brought up the fact that, hey, that might be too broad. And now I get that. At this point, I'm just pointing out the conflict, right? And that the fact is we have identified 2 overlapping jurisdictions. I really didn't think about Westchester Joint Waterworks. That's an example there. Could it apply to the school districts? It's just we've identified 2, but no others, right? And so maybe as a group we could think about this and say, okay, how do we clear this conflict by identifying others or creating language that says if the appearance of conflict by you're working for or appearing before another agency that may have an impact on the village of Mamaroneck, should be brought forward. And I just toss that out. I don't know if that's the right solution, right? But I do think it's important to identify that we, in the village of Mamaroneck, or the town of Mamaroneck, the town of Rye, we have other jurisdictions that have similar overlap.
Maybe we impose upon the member, if the situation arises, a duty to ask the board for leave to appear as part of their paid employment before another village, town, or whatever city. In other words, flip it so that rather than picking which entity they can't appear in front of or applying a complete ban, they must apply for the consent of the Board of Ethics to do so. Let's think about that.
Yeah, I think it's broader also than just like this. In number 2, we're trying to, it's not just being employed by the village, like that's easy, right? Or town of Rye or town of, like, but I think we want to ensure that, I think our definition is broader than just these 3-4 entities, right? We want, why is this just about being employed by the villages or towns? I think we want to make sure that they're not employed by, I think, can I just see below 6? Because by any entity that would be in conflict with their role on the ethics board. So I just can't remember why we focus just on the village and town entities.
I think it's because they're most likely to encounter a conflict of interest because of issues that are appearing that relate directly to certainly the village of Mamaroneck and therefore it could impact them as employees. And then
And
for them
also,
to,
I mean, we could say village or board, village or town in the county. Like you could say that, and it's all inclusive. But I if we're not sure, because I'm not sure why we would be adding Harrison.
well, Harrison is because of the Westchester Joint Waterworks that we jointly own with the town of Mamaroneck and the town of Harrison. And then the town of Rye, I think the reason why, and I think in the original law, the reason why before the village of Mamaroneck, that's because they're, that would be, in my opinion, a direct conflict. And then the town of Rye and the town of Mamaroneck, because there would be the appearance of a potential quid pro quo,
All right, anything with Larchmont or just there's nothing jointly owned with Larchmont?
No, I mean, yeah, obviously the town of Mamaroneck, the village is split by the town of Rye and the town of Mamaroneck. I mean,
Right. No.
they're half within, well, 60-40. But I think that's why those were included, because there clearly could be some overlap.
All right.
with
I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I understand people's points. Maybe no municipality in the county, including the county. I don't know what the solution is, but I think what you get to there is you start limiting your pool of
Right.
potential ethics board members by maybe too much.
Yeah, but I think part of this, though, we could clear the hurdle by just talking about disclosure. That the involved person should disclose their involvement, or if they put it out in front, right? This is what I'm doing.
Has there ever been, and John, do you recall whether this was put in there or was there an issue involving somebody? What, a conflict?
You mean an ethics board member
Yeah.
with a conflict?
Yeah.
You know, not that I'm aware of.
Dan, I hear what you're saying, and the likelihood is it's probably nil, but I think that we've gone through this with really a fine tooth comb, and that for us to get to the point and say, well, this will never happen,
Yeah.
might bring us back to this point again 10 years from now.
Yeah.
So at a minimum, maybe we just talk about the closure here, right? If there is a conflict, that out.
I'm sorry, what was the last part of what you said, Mike?
Just, I don't want to get to the point where we say this is never going to happen. For me, I
Right.
think that we're making a mistake when we look at any one section here and say it won't happen, because I think one of the reasons we're formed is because things did happen. So
Yeah,
it's
I
better
get it.
that,
I was just wondering whether that it was in there because it was triggered by an actual controversy. Okay, well, to be continued. We are at the hour 7 mark.
Can I make one comment? Because I was just reading ahead.
Yeah.
Number 6, the changing of a political party. It doesn't happen quickly in New York State, so it's faster than it used to be. But if you change your political registration between February 15th and the day of the June primary, it's not effective till after the June primary.
After the primary?
After the primary, yeah. So you can't change your political affiliation for the purposes of running or voting in a party. It used to be a much longer time frame, but when they consolidated the June and September primaries, so all of the primaries are now aligned with the state June primary. So basically you have to, it's like, I think it's February 14th till this year, June 26th or something. So if somebody might think they changed their registration, but it wouldn't be effective.
Yeah, but what we're saying is if you change your registration, well, it may not be effective. And if you have altered the spirit or changed the intent of the law, so you're telling the board, or you're telling you're making the village aware that there is now an impermissible imbalance, or there will be.
Yeah. I'm just
So-
saying, if you were to try and check with the Board of Elections, the party registration hasn't actually been changed.
I understand.
So I don't know if that factors into your thinking, but I just thought it's going to get raised. It's going to get.
Right. And where does the imbalance occur? Is it when you file to change, or when the registration actually takes place?
I think it's when the intent of the member becomes aware.
I agree, intent.
So then we should just say, in the event a Board of Ethics member files to change their party registration.
Yeah, that might be a better way of doing it.
And then just say they should notify within 48 hours of the filing instead of the change of registration.
Okay.
And you're covered. Sorry, thank you.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you.
But like Nora said, there's no way to really police that.
Yeah, it will become, but if it becomes evident and there
Right.
was a failure to notify, then that's a violation of the code
Right.
within the statute of limitations. Okay. Any other matters that we should discuss this evening? We accomplished quite a bit. That was a very good meeting with Augie and Sally, and we worked our way through a couple of sections. We're working our way towards the end of the code. There are some additional sections I've brought up at the end, and then I want to take up anything that Tom Murphy and Mark Ettinger brought up at a future meeting, but we're making great progress. If there is no further business this evening, is there a motion to adjourn? No, everybody wants to keep going.
All right, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
Have a wonderful, comfortable, nice, warm end of the week. And we'll see you all. You'll hear from me, of course, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Okay,
very
great.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.